Okay, so we're here with school board candidate Keith Coleman. Keith, do you want to tell us a little bit about why you're running this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Uh, I'm uh, I'm running. I've been running in some respects my whole life. My mom was an educator, taught at Crenshaw High over 25 years in special education. My dad's a clinical professor. My aunt worked for LA County Education. All my cousins work inside of education as teachers and principals. So education is me. I started at Montessori here in Santa Monica. But I'm really running to democratize opportunity for all students. And what that really means is a blend of what a multifaceted concept of equity really is, and the sense of recognizing that students have more robust characteristics than the standardized testing format that an ACT and SAT and GPA frames have created for many girls and students of color. And so I've been inside of that space assisting students with opportunity exposure, and have served on the IDAC committee for the district. I have a son at Lincoln, and so I've got skin in the game in terms of how he's going to be educated for the next 6 years. And so this is a call to serve. My experience inside of various industry sectors, from finance to government to currency arbitrage to education innovation and economic research and et cetera, has me have deep recognition to be able to touch different aspects of what education is. And so along with my work inside of applied positive psychology, focusing in on reframing how we can work on trust and using appreciative inquiry and things like that to create better opportunities for students in our policy work. So that's the reason why I'm running.
Great, thank you, Keith. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about is in regard to the your response to the California Democratic Party platform. And I really appreciate your thoughtful response, especially in calling into question the Santa Monica Democratic Club's own role, because as we recently acknowledged, we have a long way to go in our own process. We currently have an all-white board, which is a major issue, and we have a lot of issues, although we have been addressing them. But with due respect, since you're the candidate and the club is not, I wanted to just give you the opportunity to address some of the progressive and social justice issues in the platform that you raise attention to for our club. What has been your experience in taking action and on those issues?
Well, firstly, when people talk about equity and social justice and things like that, we've really got to look at that from a multi-pronged view. These things are not just related to the district or education itself. These are structural issues socially, in law, and finance, and government. And so it's a broader view of what equity actually really is. And so that would be the first place, I think, that would hope that perhaps as the platform describes, that in the future that these connected but maybe less than connected frames can work more in concert together, so that policy, which we all know sometimes can have yawning gaps and be disconnected from what the outcome really is. And so some of my questions were to try and get a positive metric on where the Democratic Party is relative to some of these issues. And so one of the questions was really related to even a California Commission on the Status of Women descriptor, which is how do young girls, after 13 fall off the cliff when it comes to science and mathematics? And how can we do a better job of ensuring that these young girls who have that interest level still stay inside of those particular forms of thinking. The other thing inside of that platform, and this is also where policy may disconnect, is how are we really bridging the gap between racialized and microaggressions and other forms of prejudice. So I'm supportive of what the district has done with social justice, and perhaps, one could say even the Democratic Party, but we've got to move beyond even just plaudits, and we have to move beyond what we think is a platform that is worthwhile, to really look at whether or not it's functioning, again, for those who are the end users of it. And so what I mean by that is it's clear that through the student Instagram blog, Dear Samo High, as well as the news incident in Malibu, that there's still a lot of work to do. The Instagram blog, Dear Samo High, was painful. It hurt me. I shared some of it with my son, who went to Samo 4 years ago, and he kind of nodded his head. So, but when you've got, swastikas on a chalkboard and all sorts of other microaggressions about race, that's not a psychologically safe place for a student, and in some respects, neither for the teachers and staff, to exist, to be their best self. And so I would hope that, again, the Democratic Party is able to go beyond language to actionable items that can help address, those kinds of issues. And there's some other stuff on there about transportation, some budget issues. I really think that the mental health and well-being of parents and students is a huge issue. And so if the Democratic Party wants to continue to be forward-thinking, I think there needs to be a renewed focus in that area, because, like many parents in the district with kids not in school, and all of us, the anxiety and feeling overwhelmed, and the stressors are real. And the kids are facing those things too. And so other than reading some articles in The Economist or The Atlantic or New York Times about it, I haven't seen real actionable work in terms of creating things for students, perhaps to meet them where they are, because a lot of students culturally have a stigma against mental health. How are we going to help them? How are we going to help them to sort of handle where they are and sort of grow and develop? And so I've been in talks actually with a firm in San Francisco, a tech firm that's using voice assistant platform Siri, because kids are into that, and a conversational technology kind of AI platform where the kids can actually talk to Siri and can be a trusted intermediary to help them move forward with their own self-efficacy. But I don't hear any districts talking about that. I hear districts saying, we got school counselors on campus, but there is no campus. And so I really think we need to focus in on mental health and well-being of parents and students as we move forward. So hopefully the party can do that.
Thanks so much. That was really clarifying. Let's go to Dami.
Hi, Keith. How are you?
Hey, Dami. Okay. How are you?
Good. I work a lot with the school district, et cetera. So I want to ask some questions regarding that. So now you've definitely mentioned that your family's very deep involvement with teaching and schools,
Yes.
but you list Capital Partners as your employer.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So you work investment or venture capital?
Actually, that's a capital with an O. So that's the kind of governmental affairs, economic research arm.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. I was looking at both. Yeah, I was like, okay.
Yeah, no, the finance work I do is through Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs. I've been part of Stanford Angels since 2012.
I was confused because you were mentioning both in your background, so that's why I was kind of trying to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you do at your present, your employment? What is your,
Yeah, so I've been engaged in economic development strategies. As you might have also looked, I spent the last year as a visiting scholar up at MediaX at Stanford through the graduate school education there. And MediaX acts as a industry affiliate between a lot of departments on campus have IP, and they connect that IP with industry off campus. And so I'm a scholar up there. I'm up there all the time working on mentoring.
Amazing. Yeah, super interesting. Really super interesting. So this is more the nuts and bolts of like running things down here and dealing. So your son is at Lincoln, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And how long has he been in the school district?
He's been at Roosevelt since what, second grade or something?
Okay,
like that?
so he's gone through the whole. Okay, so you've been through the whole system.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we're just asking because the thought of especially on the board. There's going to be a lot of the political work with dealing with Sacramento and all kinds of issues of local politics, et cetera. But you obviously have a lot in your background there. Just trying to mesh that together with some of the local duties you'd be dealing with and your background specifically there.
Yeah, so the policy work is I got that under my belt. The governmental affairs stuff, advocacy work. So I do have deep experience in that way, and so I certainly do recognize that over the years I've become even more diplomatic. So and that's a good thing when you're trying to balance various issues and various interests. One of the things that I did speak about again, and some have found this to be not a hot button issue, but they look at me askance a little bit. But my interaction with unions when I dealt a lot with the city of LA in Bureau of Engineering, and then also as a consultant, I think we have to reframe that relationship too. And with respect to the district itself, how the district views unions and how unions view their membership and teachers, that we can utilize some tools, not professional development training, but to really look at it from a more design thinking point of view. Not as a consultant, not godly speak, but looking at it from the lens of how is this going to better humanity and how is this going to better students. And because sometimes what can happen in policy negotiations is that the adults can move into a place that actually does not have the student as the core goal. And that happens in negotiations.
Yeah.
And so I think that we can do a better job with that as a Democratic Party, even to focus in on appreciative inquiry and some other things, to help us govern better, so we can all have a better sustainable quality of life. And that's for real. We need to do that.
Very good. No, I'm glad I asked. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's go to Derek.
So I've asked this of all the other candidates. In today's day and age, I think with the issues that come up regarding limits on police power and the executive branch and legislative and judicial branch, there's really not an effective working knowledge of the Constitution and where people's rights actually come from. People talk about the rights, but they don't really know how far those rights tend to go or where they come from. How do you feel about a semester-long class on the Constitution that completion would be a requirement towards graduation?
Well, I think that was one of the bullets, if I can look down here for a second. Yeah, I actually asked the question about where the party's position was on trying to restore civics in schools. Because, one of the things that we all know intergenerationally, there's been less of that. Now, clearly over the last last 4 months or 6 months, we've seen a certain generation, I think that's millennial, but Gen Z, we've seen young people do unheralded, amazing things in terms of, their focus and leadership in providing support for COVID-related and social justice-related things. It's been phenomenal. That said, having civics and having other kinds of concepts of practical wisdom, of things related to more cooperative practices at an earlier age, in middle school even perhaps, similar to a lot of the science of well-being stuff they want down in middle school age. I think that makes complete sense. I would be a supporter of that. And I actually think that the younger students would have interest in that. Again, through the student-led Instagram blog, Dear Sam Mohai, as well as me talking to my own son, sometimes students seem to feel that they don't have a voice. And we've been hearing this: don't have a voice, give them a voice, help them with a voice. This is their voice. It's become this odd mantra when you hear that, but I don't know when that is really happening. And so having students be able to understand more about civics and government and law and see that in a more comprehensive way and how they can be involved in that, I think that would be fantastic, and they would be really excited about that, and that will help us in the long run.
So if I may, just to be clear, my question is specific. I know it's kind of ridiculous that it's specific, but a class semester long just on the United States Constitution. And also as a follow-up, how do you feel about the voting age being changed to 16 to allow younger people more of a voice?
Well, I'll go for the second question first, 17, and then the Constitution again, more clarity on that. I agree with 17. I think that we need to give younger people more a sense of self-agency. Yeah, I wouldn't call it really a sense of responsibility, but you know, people want to be authentic. The whole uh, social justice and vision of systemic racism and et cetera is a question of mattering and meaning. And so if you're 17 years old and you don't think you matter and don't think you have meaning, you know, that's you know, you got another year perhaps. So I think that reframing at the 17 and talking about that, why that is, I think actually could bring alive a number of 16 and 17-year-olds and even 15-year-olds to look at things in a little different way. Now, in terms of the Constitution, the reason why I made the description as I did is because looking at the Constitution, that kind of, I think, would determine who's going to be teaching that. What's the frame on that? It's not going to be a constitutional lawyer, probably, but I think there's a deep need for context and relevance when that is done, because we don't want to find certain forms of the Constitution being discussed, which brings certain kind of implicit and in some respects explicit bias. And so I would love to have the Constitution being put forward in classes, but we want to ensure that those who are sharing that information and guiding our students have contextual relevance of diversity of thought when it comes to the Constitution. And that's very, very critical. It's a bedrock of critical race studies and et cetera. So if we can do that, I'm for it.
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate it.
Okay, who's next? Amy.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful input. One of the things I did many years back as a vice chair of the Commission on the Status of Women is create a report on the status of women and girls in our community. And one of the things that often happens when education and resources are evaluated is the conversation of equity is not present or is missing in the data. And we found that when we were producing our report. And one of the things I want to ask you specifically is because mental social development of girls is often something that is explained, but not necessarily given a framework to say their future could be whatever they want. We don't put that into our planning. We don't exercise intentional processes so that the gender equity frame or the participation can be present, and the decisions for young girls that are looking to become involved in trade or whatever as their future, as their interests develop, is an option. What would you like to see bringing forward in terms of your resources and aptitude to see these different relationships in terms of addressing gender equity?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And so if I could have just a few seconds to respond. One anecdotal story really quickly is about a young lady from Anaheim Union High School District, which is a very tough school down in Orange County, very poor and this and that. And this 16-year-old Latina, after our modules through aerobotics with the TUS Foundation and critical thinking and policy and entrepreneurship modules they embraced, came up with a business model to have drones be supported by LiDAR, which is a certain kind of infrared practice, and move them in former theaters of war, so the drones could go and find unexploded ordnance so kids' legs don't get blown off. Now, if you would have seen this girl, you might have just said, "Oh yeah, she's just little Sally Hernandez, blah blah blah." No, this girl was brilliant, and so that sense of opportunity exposure is a critical part of ensuring that continues to sort of move forward for agency for the student, for the young woman. Secondly, what you just talked about, we just engaged through our University Alumni Angel Group here in Southern California, which I'm a co-founder of. So Stanford Angels SoCal, we 2 months ago, we just had a webinar for women founders and funders, and it was on overcoming bias and taking risk. And so this was a composition of a couple different venture capital firms run by women, and a host of women funders, and then another woman that was a tech attorney for, well, I won't say the name of the firm, but here in LA. And so they talked about what you just spoke of, which is all of the kind of implicit bias that occurs inside of that particular investment management space of venture capital and technology. And it was really powerful to listen to the funders and the founders talk about what happens in questions, senses of expectation. So there's all sorts of moving parts when those things occur in that space. And so I think it's really important to have conversations with men, and specifically with white men, because white men run, finance in this country anyway, that can help them to understand their own biases when it comes to asking certain questions of a woman startup founder that they would not ask of a male startup founder. Whether they're more deficits-based questions, projections questions, or questions that may derail a more optimistic view of whether or not that firm can become a unicorn, right? So these kinds of things are really real. And I think that there needs to be continued work in that space, because clearly there's data and research to show that women founders, firms, are making profit in a way and being successful at numbers that outperform perhaps males. And so it's not just a matter of fairness; it's a matter of what this country is about. So it's constitutional. This country is based on capitalism. And so that drives jobs, that drives the tax base, that creates economic security, economic mobility. And ultimately that, creates national security. And so I'm really passionate about this stuff. And, we'll continue to work to provide opportunity exposure for the students in the district, to get them those chances to explore things with all of the IP that's in Santa Monica. That's just, there's so many opportunities for these students, even digitally now, to touch base with all the firms and industries that are in Santa Monica so they can be the best that they can be. And so I think that there's a lot of work to do there, and I'm committed to do that.
Great. Well, I think that's about, okay, Ed, you get the last word. Go ahead, Ed. One more question from Ed.
All right, Keith.
Hey, Ed.
Yeah, quick question. Is there
Sure.
anything about the policies or votes on specific issues that the current sitting school board has done that you disagree with, that would propel you into wanting to displace one of those people?
As I mentioned before, and this is not throwing rocks, and I hope that as we've had this conversation today, that I hope you've been able to glean that I'm more focused on opportunity rather than just, being negative and hammering on issues, right? Because that's just what any kind of, lean startup thinking would do. That's Professor Kelly from IDEO up at the D School. So I won't specifically sort of point something out in that way, but I will speak about something that is challenging to me. And that is when systems manipulate data, that can be very problematic. And so what I mean by that is that if you looked at district statistics relative to boys, all the young males and their proficiency in mathematics, numbers look good for Santa Monica, Malibu, Unified, because all that data is aggregated. But when you disaggregate for certain population, in this particular case, young Black boys, they have less than 10% proficiency in math at their grade level. Now, am I going to point the finger at something that they did? Well, perhaps, because their charge is to provide opportunity and frames of learning for all the students. And that's not happening for some of the students. And so what I would say is, let's look at what that is, think about it very clearly, try and meet the students where they're at, and see what other kind of relationships, allyships, different kinds of public-private partnerships that can deal with those kinds of issues where the policy is not meeting the output, and just be very actionable oriented about it. And so, and I think that it is best to be upfront with that kind of information, because it makes people feel like me. When I got onto the Intercultural Equity and Excellence Committee, I got on there and it made me feel like, you know, they were hiding that this particular population, these young Black, they were trying to hide the information. And so they would say that they've been transparent, but I think that one of the other things that we're talking about here with the party as well is a certain need for transparency, because if you don't have transparency and if you don't have trust, it's very challenging to have social cohesion and I think really to govern well. And so that's another thing that I would put out there. And that is also related to, you know, relationships with the union and the teachers union and the teachers themselves. So
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, Keith, thanks so much for coming in. That's about all the time we've got, but I really appreciate it.
I appreciate seeing all you guys, and we'll see you at one of the next meetings.
Yeah, for sure. We'll be in touch soon. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.